Why, hello, people of planet Earth, wherever you are watching and listening from. I greet you from the interwebs deep inside of your computer or smartphone on the other side here in Austin, Texas. I'm Jacob Sager, and to, at least on my screen, appears to, I guess would be my left, but on the right of the screen is Sara Sands, who's also joining me, my host extraordinaire, co-host extraordinaire, and you are watching Liberal Arts MBA. It is a live
Welcome
stream
back,
show.
folks. It's been a while.
We're here. Yeah. We have not been on air since the summer fall of 2021, if I'm correct. And
Yep, that's right.
well, that's because someone's been really busy. Sarah, what have you been up to since then?
Oh
I mean,
yeah,
like a
I've done
lot.
like I've done a handful of things. So as some of our dedicated listeners might recall, I was deep in the throes of my PhD, and since that time, I proposed a dissertation, wrote a dissertation, defended a dissertation, and now Columbia informs me as of yesterday that my diploma is declaring me an official Doctor of Philosophy in Politics and Education, that those documents are in the mail. So a
Woo!
whole of life has happened in between now and September 2021.
Well, a mucho mazel tov to you here on behalf of the show, which is you and I and all our guests, past, present, future, and our audience, of course. Uh, we are here today. It is a brand new kind of episode before we jump into a new season, in which we will do our normal thing. In the
And
previous
what was
season,
our
we
normal thing?
interviewed.
Yeah.
In the previous season, we interviewed a dozen people about their lives, and particularly their path from their education and their desire of going through college and maybe other forms of education or not, through the career and where they found themselves at the time we were interviewing them. Many a
Yeah.
times in the place that they really crafted for themselves uniquely. Um, so, Sarah, like what are some of the big themes and ideas we found through those discussions?
Oh, yeah. Well, we found that often it's about creating opportunities for yourself and then identifying that those are the things you really want and pursuing them, regardless of what anyone else around you might think is the right choice for you. So we found a whole lot of visioning had to happen, and also a whole lot of experimentation, that people did a little bit of this and a little bit of that and weren't afraid to, drop out of med school or drop out of MBA programs and go and start something new for themselves that felt more authentic to who they were on their journey. So those are some of the takeaways. What are some things that are still sticking with you and that you're still thinking about from that season?
One thing that stood out for me was that your undergraduate choices usually don't define your career choices later on,
Not at
in a
all.
lot of ways that people would expect once they were first making them, and that's for the better. And there's also kind of like no way to prepare for the impact of the choices you're going to make other than to kind of lean into them and know that they're the right choice for you. Sometimes even in the face of no agreement from academic advisors, parents, professional colleagues, whoever it is, romantic partners. um, that was one thing that just sticks out to me, is that, just that kind of like old fashioned, there's a voice inside of you, and you can't deny it too long or you'll go crazy. That was another thing that comes out. If you deny that
Yeah.
voice too much, you either end up putting yourself somewhere toxic, or it's just is toxic because it's incongruent with your whatever it is, your constitution. What
Yeah.
It's different for everyone, right?
Yeah, and I think people really found that, often through being able to other themselves in some way, shape, or form. So whether it was going abroad or, starting an organization that was like totally outside of what they had been doing before, or, choosing to go to a different university than what they thought was really going to be the place for them, that people found that they had to have, an experience outside of what they come to expect for themselves, and to learn about themselves and others through that sort of context. And that really stuck with them. I think everyone we talked to, at some point had the opportunity to travel. We didn't even have to ask it. People offered it up. and found that like that was the thing that helped them really identify who it was they wanted to be and how they wanted to build their careers, how they wanted to lead in the world, and how they wanted to define community for themselves and put themselves in conversation with those communities. And that to me continues to rumble around in my mind a little bit. So do we want to talk about what we're doing now?
Yeah, I think you should introduce this particular episode because it kind of came out of the genesis, a need to absolutely get into what this episode is about, but also maybe to open it up and make it a complimentary series to our interviews with people.
Yeah. So, in interviewing people about their college to career to leadership journeys, that's how I've been framing it. Those of you who have been, longtime listeners, first time caller, longtime listener, probably heard us talk a lot about, start to bring in some of the research that exists on some of these topics around career choice and decision making, but also like, understanding, for instance, like the way the immigrant experience functions, or the way that college is experienced and learning in general is experienced by people of different races and creeds and religions and sexualities, that these are not, homogenous experiences for people. And we have a lot of research on this. And we're also at a time, where there is a high volume of content out there, a lot of media messages happening. And we can't bring that all into our normal season. And also the normal season takes a lot of time to produce and to vision. And so we wanted to be in conversation with the topics of today as they were coming up. And so something that, Jacob and I have been tuned into is like, what is out there in the popular zeitgeist that should be in conversation and dialogue with the things that we care about in Liberal Arts MBA, which brings us to today of a new segment that we're launching called Opinions on Opinions, or a working title anyways, where, things that we read that seem to have like high currency out in the culture and out in the popular zeitgeist of things, that, usually for me, it makes me want to like scream and rant and rage. And I want to do that with other smart people. And so we have came across our first set of articles where we wanted to really like bring this into conversation with the show and bring this in conversation with each other and with y'all. And so that is how we got here today with our new little mini series. And so I'll just dive in, Jacob, with what we're going to talk about today. So some of you may have read out there, it was blowing up on my Twitter feed, which is a lot of admittedly ed policy wonks and education researchers. But two big articles really hit the mainstream. Well, the first is an article from The New Yorker by Nathan Heller called The End of the English Major, which seems to really be about that students today do not want to study the humanities, particularly English, and this is causing universities to cut the humanities or seek funds to make them sexy and attractive to students again. And Heller kind of claims that, it seems that students are more focused on practical degrees that lead to high-paying jobs, and that studying English is no longer, in their minds, what guarantees a successful career. And so they are backing out. And so, of course, this was interesting to us as two English majors that have been gainfully employed for most of our lives now, not always, but for most of it. And so, Heller talks about a number of different things, the institutional, economic, social, and political circumstances that we find ourselves in now that might be leading to a decline of students study English. But as we'll get to, he really seems to find that it is the choice of individual students that is ultimately responsible for the demise and rejuvenation, maybe, of English departments. And so a fun little, it is about the individual narrative there. And then there was another article, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Brooke Allen that came out sort of seeming in response to this, but took things in a direction where I almost threw my computer at the wall while I was reading it one night. And so, the op-ed is called "College Should Be More Like Prison." And which I don't even know where to start with the headline as much as I don't know where to start with the graphic. If you've not seen the
There's a
graphic,
Philip Roth novel called Indignant, and the premise of it is that a father, it's probably like the 50s, just after World War II, sends his son to college in the Midwest, to a very like small town college that is culturally locked off, as a like way to try to protect him from society that's changing. It just popped in my head. I actually have never read the novel. That's just really like the blurb you want, on the back to read it. But that's when I thought of that title, I thought of that blurb, because it is just, who would say that?
we are going
That
to get
title.
into that in a second.
Yeah, right,
So,
right.
as for those of you who have not read it, this op-ed, which, maybe you don't want to read it and just listen to what we have to say here. Don't give them more clicks. Or do you read it? I don't know. But basically, the author argues, Brooke Allen, who I think used to teach at Bennington College and looks like she hasn't taught there since like 2018. But she argues that the choice afforded to students in college and the freedom students have to use technology makes them poor and unserious learners. And that indeed the author is grateful and prefers no longer teaching students in traditional institutions of higher ed, but instead teaches in a 4-credit college program that is provided to prisoners, and which, these programs can do amazing work. I highly recommend people check out the PBS documentary on the Bard College program in prisons. But anyways, the author asserts that if only more students were cut off from the trappings of, what she refers to as civilization, including technology and the woes of the diversity statements, and also the plague of atheism that seems to have overtaken the undergraduate community. And if only they were cut off from those things, and really that college was a prison, which seems to be benefiting her students because her students are able to, for example, overlook the racism of the past, no mention of the racism of the present, and also overlook their own political differences now to learn something. And by golly, these prisoners, they can do it all without yawning or even needing a bathroom break. And so she wishes that colleges were like prisons, because she finds that her students are better learners because of their desire and desperation to learn. What a set of articles to respond to. So, Jacob, where do we want to start here?
Well, let's just talk about that first article. I mean, it's really, Nathan Heller's piece is a much larger essay anyway. He spoke with a lot of people at Harvard, at ASU, different places.
Very different schools, very different climates, very different
one
student
person who
population.
stood out to me that I really liked as a student, he was talking to a young Arab undergraduate who's going to go to med school and become a doctor. And she said she grew up with novels and things of that nature. She loves reading, and that she started a humanities program for pre-med. I think she was at ASU. It's that's not necessarily, I don't have it in my notes here. For me, I think that's a huge, really valuable and beautiful statement there, that kind of counters a lot of this. That there's like, in the people who want to go and get these STEM degrees, they really actually the humanities are a huge part of their life. So much so that if they don't see it at their undergraduate institution for them, they'll create kind of the places and niches for that. So, and that does come up in a lot of the conversations that Nathan has there with other students that pick a STEM degree, right? They do have a personal desire or yearning or leaning towards the liberal arts, and particularly towards English or something of that nature. But either the narrative in society about how they're trying to get a job and who they need to be says don't do that, or they're just seeing kind of the decline around them that the department isn't that exciting, and so they go somewhere else. But there was all these examples, including this one undergraduate who was reading Don Quixote, which is like, even in my English undergrad, I never read that in the classes. I avoided that because it's a huge novel, and it's just like, for me, not necessarily my particular reading cup of tea. But I think it shows that the skill and desire is out there among these students. What's something that stood out to you from that article or about those students?
Yeah, well, I want to build on some of what you were just saying, because I think there's a few things that are kind of overlooked in the way that Heller approaches this piece, and that I think, as you're finding, are actually like celebrations of some things that we did really well in this country. Surprisingly, like things that are actually going okay, and also things that like represent, a balancing act. So, I also took note of the fact that he really zeroed in on, what seemed to be a lot of immigrant students, which I think we need to return to, or children of immigrants, if the students were not immigrants themselves, and that they were really leaning into STEM careers. And, he kind of touts this, and the university people that he talks to, kind of poo-poo it as like, these students aren't interested in the humanities or in English and they don't value it. But on the other hand, like, I would venture that since, A Nation at Risk comes out in like 1983, it's like this like quintessential education policy report that basically says like it causes a sort of crisis and a sort of panic that American students are falling so far behind in science and math, and also in reading and in parts of the humanities, but like that our understanding of science and math and technology and engineering and all these things, that American students are doing so poorly in them that all the other nations developing around the world are about to overtake us. And this causes, many, many different movements that can be traced back to this. The rise of standardized testing as we know it now, the rise of like accountability movements can be traced back to this. But what eventually kind of snowballs out, I'm skipping a lot of important things here because the history of education policy is complicated, but we ultimately have a big push to prepare students for STEM, for science, technology, engineering, and math, to pursue those degrees. And this snowballs over time to be a real focus on, children of immigrants or children who are immigrants themselves, and English language learners, and Black and brown students, and low income students, and women, that we create and fund all of these programs for students to do what this article says is happening, that they're going and pursuing STEM degrees. So in some ways, where they find a fault with this is actually, from the anecdotal evidence here, might lead us to think that we were successful in these policy implementations, and that these students are going and doing STEM degrees. Like what a mitzvah that we've done. We've succeeded here. Now, the research is kind of, in some ways we've succeeded, in some ways we haven't. But based on the anecdotal evidence here, it would seem like we're doing okay. The other thing that I just want to say is like, there is a fair point here, which is we did at some point, I was like working in a foundation at the time when I started seeing this happening, and that there was a big emphasis on STEM. And then all of a sudden you started to see this thing called STEAM, which was science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, I think, which was to say that maybe we needed some of the humanities infused into these programs as well, that there was like a symbiotic relationship there. And so it's not that we have given up on it or moved away from it. In fact, what we've seen more over, the past decade, I would say, is like a rebalancing of things to think about how these things are not mutually exclusive, but mutually beneficial to each other. And that whole narrative is just absent and missing from this. And so some of what you were saying just made me think about how that wasn't there, but it's what we talk about all the time, that these things need each other to be successful, that you can't have one without the other, that the critical thinking that comes from the arts and studying English and languages actually is like really beneficial to STEM. Yeah, that's where I got to.
Yeah, I recently, well, there's one part in that article where I want to say it's one of the professors there at Harvard is talking about how during the Obama administration they really epitomized coming to the STEM acronym, and it was repeated over and over again. But that is the culmination of what you're talking about of 30, 40 years of of that philosophy and that mindset that we're going to fall behind with the engineers, which, if you're to look at some of the labor statistics, also anecdotally, I don't have them on me myself, is our country filling the engineering gaps that we have between one generation to the next? I know in a lot of major towns and communities, we talk about STEM. Well, like the T, there's plenty of old technologies that are still everyday parts of our lives, and there's um, plenty of communities. This is not everywhere in the United States, but plenty of communities that never value or stress the opportunity of non-college vocational education, particularly in many of the mechanical arts. And I'll call it that because the people who do this are amazing. Sometimes maybe they're following like big plans, and whatever it is may not seem so artful, but it really is. But it is a technology use, and that's not necessarily always included when people talk about STEM. They're really trying to like push putting on a lab coat and going into these prestigious things that require a lot of higher education schooling as kind of the end point of all of that. The other thing, just about like the loss of the A, is that it ends up becoming weird, I think, for a certain generation, in that they want to put that A back in there, but then it sounds, and some of the people talk about this in the article, they feel almost embarrassed about the pursuit with all these other technologies, or with more of the emphasis in society on the STEM degrees. It just doesn't sound valuable now to your peers. Somebody says in the article that they kind of felt that the people who are getting the humanities degrees, it is a joke, but they wouldn't say it to them, which I think is
something for like rich posh kids that attended, rich poshy boarding schools, and that now everyone else feels left out in it, and which I'm certainly here for meaning making of people's different experiences in these things, and we do have a lot more work to do on college campuses to ensure that classes aren't just diverse but feel inclusive, and that people feel belonging in them, which is certainly a part of it. But yeah, I want to talk about the student piece here, particularly like the emphasis that, it sounds like here that like students are kind of being poo-pooed and looked down upon for thinking that they should go to college and get quote unquote like employable, transferable skills. And that English or other humanities aren't seen as part of that. And he does, he starts to talk a little bit about how, like, students are getting these messages from their families, and they're getting them from like the media, and they're getting them from like, whatever it is they're watching or reading or whatever. But what I think he does a poor job of is acknowledging the political and social and economic context in which that has happened. And we can't ignore that. We have to talk about it. So I'm going to talk about it, which is that we have spent a long time, and we talk about this on last season, telling students that only some degrees are profitable and that only some degrees lead to employability. And, we then put out statistics every year of like, well, this is how the industries are changing, and this is where we need to, this is how we need to employ more people. And we need to design these post-secondary programs to really give scholarships to kids to study these things like engineering, like, computer programming and data science and data analytics. And, we need more biomedical engineers. And so we need to push them towards that. That's not like an absent agenda. Like, that's been very much a present agenda in how we've designed and emphasized different post-secondary pathways. And we've even created high school programs specifically around the idea of, high school academies to get students to study these things, to then go on to do them in college, and then go on to get those jobs. I mean, that has been pretty consistent messaging for as long as, you and me have been alive anyways, you and I have been alive. And so to then turn around and say, well, students now don't think that English is valuable. Well, where have been the messaging around that? Like, who was actually talking about that? And pair that then with, the other thing I'll just say here that is really missing Heller mentions the student debt crisis. He doesn't call it a crisis, but he mentions that the student loans are an issue. But this is a big part of it. If you don't believe, based on all the messaging you've been given, that a career in English provides you with the transferable skill sets to go and do things like policy analysis, which they even separate from an ability to write an essay in this particular article, which as an English major, not a policy wonk, was crazy to me. But if you don't believe that this is a good investment in your career, knowing how much debt you'll have to take out, and I just want to pull in a little bit of the stats here. Sorry, this is where we go with this. But
Yeah, it's important. Let's go.
Dominic Baker, brilliant higher education policy professor at Southern Methodist University here in the great state of Texas. She makes this point of, why do we treat professors in one subject as though they are experts on the whole of higher education? And so I don't want to do this. And I want to bring her in to talk about her expertise around student debt. Overall, she says, 55% of student borrowers hold less than $20,000 in student loan debt. And she does acknowledge that it's rare for students to have six-figure loan balances, but there are significant differences in who borrows based on the effects of structural racism, such as denial of wealth accrual and inadequate educational resources. And in fact, when we look at students who earned a bachelor's degree in the 2015-26 school year, which was the most recent data available at the time of this publication, she says that we find that 64% of Black students held at least $20,000 in student debt, if not more. And so what this article is totally missing, she makes 3 points of things that we really need to rethink in order to make college education on a whole something that is attainable and seen as worthwhile of an investment for students. And that is, we need to take seriously the varied systemic experiences students from different racial ethnic groups have with the student loan system, which does not get talked about in the context of the immigrant students interviewed for this piece. We need to address the disproportionate need to borrow to attend higher education, which is a big part that is cited in the article as to why people don't see the humanities as viable in the long term. And then we need to enable students to easily repay these loans. Why are we talking about employability in these degrees if students can never repay the loans that they take out, and you essentially make it impossible for them to accrue wealth and replicate different systems of inequality through these degrees? Like, what are we doing about this? If you want people to study English, then make it worthwhile that they can pay off their loans with an English degree.
Let me ask you a question from the article on this piece, and really this complexity of money, race, and the conversation of what degree is valuable. Because in the article, they one of the people interviewed is Rebecca Cadenhead, upperclassman from Westchester County, who is talking about being a student of color and is a philosophy major. She says she added African American studies for fear that the philosophy department would not have many non-white thinkers. And she went on to say that she has a concern that people are going to encounter her and assume that she's there because of affirmative action. Yeah. So I just want to ask your thoughts, because that's an interesting place at which those three forces really come out. And I we know from our experience here that is not that story is a experience others have as well.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this beforehand. We were going back and forth over text about the articles, right? That when we interviewed Errol Saunders, soon to be Dr. Errol Saunders, last season, that, he had talked about the fact that, he is a Black gay man from, California. He grew up in a low-income neighborhood. His mom was a single mother. So he talks about these things. And he says, he really thought that he was going to study something in the sciences, and then fell in love with history and political science and other humanities. And so wanted to study that. And he realized, he had two choices. He had a choice between Yale and a choice between MIT. And he realized that he felt like that he couldn't go to MIT to study something that wasn't science or math related, because basically people would think that he wasn't academically skilled enough then to do that, and that he was essentially just a diversity, shuttled in for diversity admissions. And so chose Yale, where he could study what he wanted to study in the humanities and not feel that sort of stigma. And that experience is so overlooked in this article. Like, he talks about it briefly, but it's really important to understand that, when we're thinking about how we treat student degree choices, and when we treat, how they want to feel when they're studying something, in one class and their whole major coursework, that these experiences are crucial and really impact student choice. And so if we're not going to treat, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging seriously in terms of the curriculum and in terms of how we look at who is selecting different majors, then we're always going to be at a disadvantage here, because we're very, these days, we are doing our best to try to encourage everyone to find a place on a college campus. And if we're not focusing on that DEIB part, we're going to always find ourselves lacking in the humanities in this way. And we need people of color in the humanities. But if we don't make them feel like they belong there, as they should be, then we're going to always be running this problem. I mean, I don't think we've addressed it. I don't think the one sentence Heller gives to it really speaks to the depth and problem of the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of that, do we want to?
I was going to say this is I'm sorry. You said?
Oh, no.
I was going to say this is a good place we could transition over to the other article. Just because it's very prescient in that the second article is about incarcerated persons. Let's just get into that one. So the other article.
My computer again, I'm sure.
Yeah, the other article we have today that we read was a much shorter piece. It's an opinion that directly references this first article right at the beginning. It's called "College Should Be More Like Prison." It's in the Wall Street Journal by Brooke Allen. And the thing that Brooke quotes is, I think more than once in the article, I'm forgetting his first name, but a professor by the last name of Shapiro. And he's here at Harvard. And they quote him as saying that that his students couldn't handle studying Middlemarch. And that then she goes into her argument about how her students who are incarcerated prisoners have the attention span to do things like that and get deeper. And Sarah introduced that part. But I just want to bring up that quote was very selectively whittled down to make the point that this article went through. In the previous article, when they interviewed, it's James Shapiro at Columbia, he said, first he says that media has changed for everyone, that he used to read up until the mid 2000s, used to read 5 novels a month, and now you consider a good month 1 novel. And this particular professor also said he held out and didn't get a smartphone until last year, which just kudos. This person's my new hero. That's amazing. But just to give a preference, that same person is also saying my attention span, or my capacity in life in this bigger context to consume a full book, has been taken away from me. It's eroded. That's a huge thing that's totally left out there.
But I just want to say that his comment was so interesting, and her decision to use his comment as the Professor Shapiro's comment in Heller's article is then, as Jacob said, quoted in Brooke Allen's op-ed. And it sort of becomes a launch point for this really crazy racist and elitist diatribe that she goes off on. But when I really felt was so closed off about his statements and then the way they get used is that there is this assumption that the technology is all bad. And what he talks about is now students have podcasts and they have, the ability to read articles all the time on their phone. And I'm reading this and thinking that's wonderful. We have in some ways, through technology, democratized information. It doesn't sit behind the paywall all the time. It doesn't sit behind the price tag of the university. It doesn't just sit in university libraries where you can't get to it. students are really then engaging with ideas all the time and a whole variety of viewpoints. Hopefully, I know that might be a gross assumption, but like I'd like to think that they're engaging with all viewpoints all the time because of the access they have through the technology. Like they're doing exactly what we hope English majors do, which is assimilate lots of different kinds of information in order to have that inform the way that they make meaning of the world and engage with it and form opinions and then go back out into it. Like this is what we study in English. Why are we shitting on the technology for that? I don't. Oh
Yeah,
God.
absolutely. I mean, that connects me to my a big thought I had about all this, because James Shapiro also says that, like, it makes an analogy of Shakespeare reading Don Quixote and being just blown away about how the novel is this like very different thing than books were previous to the novel, and that that's similar to someone today watching Better Call Saul, which is like not a reboot, it's a different show in the same universe. It's a complex, different form of literature. And nowadays, everybody's a TV critic, has a blog and a TikTok where they're talking about television or podcasts and having critical, deep thoughts. Like, in a way, there's this reversal where being the English major is everyone's an English major nowadays at some level, I think.
So I want to address, going specifically back to this Allen piece, that like to suggest that prisons, which are like some of the most dehumanizing places that exist on the planet, that colleges should replicate this, is so wildly insensitive and uninformed and gross that I don't
Yeah,
know where to start. So I want to start with this, which is that one, education at its best requires an explicit recognition of the humanity of the learner. And our prison system is specifically designed to dehumanize. So why would we ever, if anything, we should rethink prisons entirely to be more like colleges. Like, what is going on here? This is crazy. But I want to just say this. The USA is the largest prison population in the world. And Texas, where we are reporting from, is the largest in the US. There are 437 prisoners per 100,000 people in the US, and Texas has 155,000 prisoners in it. That's like 448 per 100,000 people. We are the 9th highest population of prisoners as of 2020. And these people are people. They're not there for you to experiment on with whatever educational methodology you want to say. Like, they're not there to be experimented on anyways. These are human beings that are in a system of incarceration that devalues who they are. And it is insulting, furthermore, that nowhere in this op-ed, which I'm not surprised, but nowhere do we talk about the school to prison pipeline, that we have people in our country who have been put through a terrible system where they were criminalized from the time they were children and were denied the opportunity to go to college because of it. And then to make the statement that then colleges should be more like prisons is an absurd piece of shit that I can't even begin to describe. But I want to like unpack some of this quickly for our listeners. So there are a lot of ways that there's a lot of different ways to approach defining the school to prison pipeline. A Backer Hicks et al. 2021, they do a study, you can find it in Education Next, on proving school to prison pipeline, which is, they basically look at if stricter middle schools raise the risk of adult arrests. And they define the school to prison pipeline as a term that is often used to describe the connection between exclusionary punishments like suspensions and expulsions and involvement in the critical justice system. And they go on to say that Black and Hispanic students are far more likely than white students to be suspended or expelled, and Black and Hispanic Americans are disproportionately represented in the nation's prisons. So we can see a direct connection between the way that we criminalize and dehumanize children, particularly Black and brown children in our schools, that denies them the opportunity from the full educational experience they should have, and leads to their unfair and disproportionate incarceration and involvement in our criminal justice system. And so I bring this up to say, because Allen in her piece specifically talks about never her white prisoners in this sense, but her Black and brown prisoners, remarking at how they are able to overcome, their dislike of David Hume's and Thomas Jefferson's ideas on race, because they want to be part of a larger society, that they see the value in civilization. These men are part of our civilization. They always had the capacity to be learners. Where were the resources for these men before here? Where was the system when they were children to ensure that they had an equal educational opportunity from the outset? Where was that? To then celebrate their interest now in learning in a place of imprisonment where there's nothing else to do, where you've deprived them of connection to the outside world, to their families, to their communities, to then remark at how great they are at learning. Where was the support in the first place? These men shouldn't necessarily be in prison to begin with. And instead, you want to say that colleges should be more like prisons, because all of a sudden you see that these men are full people and can be learners. What the actual F is happening here? I had to say my piece on that.
One sentence that really kind of grossed me out there too was this sentence of they want to be part of the centuries-long conversation that makes up our civilization. The classes are often the most interesting part of these men's prison lives. In some cases, they are the only interesting part. But that was just, that reminds me of the main kind of viewpoint that I think a lot of people who want to make a conversation on education or society want to take, is like, what a broad sweeping statement. I'm sure that's absolutely true, that last sentence. I'm sure that classes, if you're in a really heavily incarcerated, heavily secure incarceration, is probably a very delightful part of your day, just in terms of that capacity alone, regardless of your pursuit of the education, just in that environment. So it's just, there is this detachment about I don't know where people are standing and where they want to go. And it's the second piece was just a very easy narrative to make about all of that. It just reminds me, it's a very like support of the classical liberal arts education in the mid-50s. Thinking of that Philip Roth novel, it's this very like mid-century conservative American white perspective that there is this canon also that's fixed, right? Like, if you really want to teach the humanities and have a great class in there, in any place, definitely Thomas Jefferson, David Hume, everyone has their place. But an important thing in the humanities, especially humanities that is grounded in the present moment and building people for the future, these are brilliant, wise people, but they lived 200 years ago. There have been thousands of conversations since then, and there is it's hard to be part of all of those, especially for some teachers out there who are just for all of us to keep up with it, if you're in a particular academic environment, to keep up with the latest knowledge. But there's just so much conversation that's happened since then, that conversation about the humanities and having that kind of classicist perspective, that it's like a mid-20th century perspective, where the kind of like Robert Adler's great books of the Western world becomes the model of what is a liberal arts education. It's like, no, those are just the books for the shelf. It's so much bigger than this. We're talking about libraries on libraries of human knowledge. And so it's just a very, I don't know, it's just a very limited perspective, and it bothers me sometimes. I feel like Professor Shapiro's kind of perspective on like how TV or some other things could relate and might be more the center of an English education in the future, than instead of novels between the Romantic period and the 20th century, which is a huge part of English education today. That's a smarter perspective. That's a present tense perspective, and a lot of people are missing that. And I don't know. That's just my thought. That people get so bound up in what it used to look like and how it used to operate, right?
Yeah. And I think this is true. This is true about two things in both of the articles. The first is who they choose to cite as like the scholars that should be studied first. And I don't think that there's like, I mean, there's still debate over it, but one of the things that these articles don't talk about is that, you know, it's talking about like English majors for the most part, right? But like there are other degrees now that didn't exist when we started measuring English majors, and one of them happens to be like cultural linguistic and gender studies. And like,
Yeah.
I don't know, I think it's a good thing that we include those as majors now, to democratize the canon. But they also take issue with the desire for students to have a say in what it is they are reading and learning. And I just want to say that, like, I've never had the experience, not to say it hasn't happened, but I've never had the experience where my students haven't been interested in reading what we might call like the classic canon of like the dead old white men in order to better understand the legacies that come after. And on top of that, I have found for me that it has not been the case when I've taught, that students have pushed back when I've intentionally included other authors on the syllabus and gotten their input on those. And you know why good professors do that? Because it's good teaching. That yes, we expect students to have, you know, an understanding of, you know, core concepts in philosophy and political science and literature and key authors that have, you know, defined a lot of what has come after, particularly in post-colonialism, which Heller does talk about. And also, why are we afraid to let students have a voice in what it is we are teaching and what it is they are learning? We should be including diverse perspectives. If you want to talk about employability, students are going to have to go out into the workforce and work with people who do not align to their perspectives and others who do. So being able to offer the full array and give students input into their learning, that is good teaching. That is creating transferable skills and helping them understand diverse viewpoints. Like, not this idea that because we've allowed students to say what they would prefer to learn, that now we're like dumbing down the curriculum in some way. Like, we're actually just being good educators. Like, it's so close to me. And the same, I think, applies to the technology. I do not think it is a celebration that we do not allow incarcerated people to have access to technology, when many of these men, we expect them to be able to go and reassimilate into society. How are we doing
Absolutely.
favors to not prepare them to use technology that is going to define their lives on the outside? How are we supposed to teach things like information literacy and media literacy? How are we supposed to help, whether they're students in prison or in college, how are we supposed to help them navigate the world if we're not going to like really think about what technology looks like in that world and how they're interacting with it?
Absolutely. I mean, the
It's
way you apply for a job today is totally different than the way you applied for a job 20 years ago. Even though 20 years ago, I bet a lot of people would have already stopped using the classified ads from the paper and started going online to listings. Still different.
right.
Technology is just constantly iterating, and the depth in which like the cultural and social nuances of usage are hard to explain. You can't really explain to somebody on the outside. Like, you have to be part of it. And so when people are cut off and they're incarcerated for more than half a decade or multiple decades, and the goal is to rehabilitate them. Yeah, that's a huge. I agree. It's a huge disadvantage because the world has changed. Even in the time since we've graduated from high school, which is also pushing 20 years now, um, just so much has changed with technology, and not just um, not just the devices themselves, but the way that people think about thinking and the way that people think about gathering knowledge. I was talking to somebody the other day just about how I really, until I got a smartphone, I could tell you 100 phone numbers all stored in my head. A piece of that was rote, typing those in on the phone at the time would save it in my head. But also, I don't have the need to save phone numbers in my head anymore. And I taught my brain that, and I've forgotten it. I probably remember your household phone number, Jason Kadam's household phone number, if I try like really hard, the one growing up.
Yeah,
But
sure.
you know, but that's because of the rote part. But and that's okay. But I can handle it. Somebody else might. They just, might be able to teach them how to send the email on their 1 week job training once they get out of prison for being there for 10, 15 years. But the nuance of how the communication is going to happen using that email or searching for the job is lost. And you can't and yeah, it's a huge disservice to those people on so many levels.
Yeah. Yeah. These articles were so problematic in many ways. The other thing, we've got a few minutes left. The thing that I feel like would be a real disservice if we didn't touch on is that, in the Heller piece in particular, I mean, this is all but absent in the Allen piece, but there's some conversation in the Heller piece about the question of funding and how institutions operate. And this is important in prisons, it's important in colleges, because where we put our money indicates what we value. And what I felt like was really hard in both these articles and made me like my stomach literally churned is that in both of them, there seems to be a little bit of like, well, this is just the way it is. And in Allen's, it's like, oh, this is the way that it should be, which is eye roll. But they don't talk about like the funding matters, and it matters who is providing that funding and for what. And so Heller does talk about, state, national, local funding has really disappeared for the humanities. It's really disappeared for like higher education in general. Like students are bearing the burden of the cost now. And the reason, part of why student debt is so high is because funding for higher education is just like the first budget item to be slashed in half, basically, in like every state legislative session. It feels like. So we're literally creating an environment. Right.
We're worried about the future. Let's stop investing in education.
Right. Jesus Christ. While at the same time, we have a very, very extensive and very well-funded for-profit prison system in this country. So we're going to slash college. I mean, we literally could have college more like prison now because we put way more money to prisons than I think we really do, the value of education in this country. And we live in Texas, so that feels particularly true. But, I think it's important to realize there's a Reckow and Snyder piece from 2014 that looks at the changes in private foundation funding for like traditional institutions like universities and state education agencies and traditional K through 12 schools. And basically from like from 2000 to 2015, like the amount that goes to universities from private funders goes from like I think it's like 11% of their total funding in education to like 6%. These are big dollars we're talking about. I mean, a drop in the bucket compared to federal money, sure. But, where funders go is what gets invested in. It's where, new ideas get to really be fostered and innovated on and, scaled. And so when you're removing money from that system and also then creating a vacuum where schools need to take more money from maybe a different set of funders, maybe they are more in line with consulting firms now, as gets mentioned in the article. Maybe they're finding, different sorts of partnerships that are more aligned to private interests and not necessarily a broad set of like public intellectualism that we could be interested in, right? Like those have real repercussions for these humanities departments. They're supposed to be sacred in both of these articles, right? And no one is really talking about that in the way that we need to be. And what it ends up in by the end of the articles is that they both put the onus on the individual to have chosen differently. And I know like this really stuck out to you, so I want you to like talk more about that. But it just really left a sour taste in my mouth that after, even in the Heller piece, acknowledging the institutional and economic and social and political structures that are limiting, the ability of universities to, really recruit students into these programs and to even match student need that might be there, that's all eschewed at the end for a focus on the individual making the decision on behalf of all of society to choose it. And that does not sit well with me. I don't know. How are you feeling about it?
I just sit with me very differently. I felt like a weird optimism at the end of the English major, and mostly in that, you and I sit at a weird place now. We graduated high school in 2006, so our entire time in college was the economic demise of the second half of the 20 aughts or whatever. And one thing from that perspective to me was that this economic idea called the bullwhip effect, I felt was like hugely in place for the space between what individuals were valuing, what the economy wanted, and what schools were offering. And the bullwhip effect is like you're a store and your customers want a bunch of things, so then you order a bunch of it and then they don't want it anymore, and so you have too much, you might go out of business because you're holding too much stock. Or then the suppliers next quarter make too much and nobody's buying it, so they're stuck with too much stock. It's just that the different segments of the economy, because it's all this weird individual choice, never line up, and you have this weird discrepancy between certain places in the supply chain. And I just, right at the end of the article, it has that weird flip in which the young student I talked to at the beginning, who's about to be graduating with a data science degree, but loved reading Don Quixote, is applying for grad school as a literature major. And very specifically, I don't even know what this means, but I want to emphasize that they brought out that they weren't going to do creative writing as a grad student. It was to study literature. And I thought that flip was interesting because it definitely was.
Writing? I hate that.
Say it again?
I was like, what's wrong with creative writing? I did literature and creative writing. Like, what is this weird?
I think the particular, it's that individual choice. I think maybe that particular individual is just like truly a real like book nerd, librarian kind of type. Yeah, I say that lovingly to whoever this person is, but like, I kind of like that because also there was this other piece of my uncle growing up said, get the humanities degree, because if you're going to be a doctor or a data scientist, you're going to have to go to grad school to get a good job, and everything you do as an undergrad, you'll just do in that first semester again. So go get the philosophy degree, go get the English degree. And I just think it's interesting because it's totally a flip on that. The person's like, go get the data science degree, and now I'm going to come back and get the literature master's. I don't know. I just don't know what it means, but it kind of excited me.
Yeah, I did also like that the second person captured at the end was doing creative writing and thought that she could be the next like big novelist. And I hope she becomes that. I hope she's the next American.
Also that picture too, where she was like right at the perfect place in college, where it's like I left with a great sense of belief in herself.
Well, I'm glad you left with optimism. I read these articles and mostly just wanted to like scream for a good bit of
only optimism from the first one.
Good, yeah, because the second one is like a train wreck that hits another train wreck, which I guess we shouldn't even talk about right now because on wood, we certainly don't need another train wreck. And
what do you want to close on? You're the one. You recommended definitely the first and second article to me, and then we're like, we got to talk about this. So, Dr. Sands, where should we end?
Yeah, I think there's probably two things that I would end on, and I say two, knowing it might be three. I think for us, I think your optimism is a good point that, we are English majors and we want to believe that the English major is not dead. And I do think that's true. I think this article is hyperbolic and that, I think there are more people that are engaging with the humanities than ever before. And because it so defines how we operate in a society now that is inundated with media messages through all sorts of mediums. And so I think that whether or not there's language to it yet, that more people than ever really see the value in understanding, the literature and the language that defines us and defines our society as a whole. And at the same time, I want to encourage those of us who are in higher ed to, maybe not be so alarmist in this. We didn't even talk about the fact that some of the numbers that get pulled out here are kind of wonky from a data perspective. And I rolled my eyes a lot and made a lot of squinty eyes like this. But that change is not a bad thing. Change is inevitable, but it could be a good thing. And so I think figuring out, how do we really think about, student agency in the learning process and invite them in to help us rethink the way that we deliver these programs and make it useful to them and make it feel authentic to them and actually embrace the diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging that, Alan says we shouldn't embrace at all and, thinks that we should dispense with for its irritation and its quote unquote like ideological purism, which is some of the arguments that get made here are whack. Not just pretty much all of hers. But that if we believe in these things and we want to make it more than just a statement that professors, submit to get hired, then how are we inviting like students as a community to participate in the learning process and the development process with us? And I think that that's like, the English major in practice at its best, right? Like, how are you bringing all these voices into a room and synthesizing them to create something new? And that possibility exists. And so I think, the ups and downs of the Heller article, the entire like downhill of the Allen piece, I think, the hope that you speak of is there if we embrace our power as educators and the power of students differently and shut down the for-profit prison system and the school to prison pipeline. Amen.
Amen. So you want to also close us out by telling all our lucky viewers out there at TV Land maybe what to expect past this first inaugural Opinions on Opinions episode?
Yes. So first inaugural Opinions on Opinions. Y'all, if you read something and you think that you want to hear the dulcet tones of our voices unpack it and go in on it, send it our way. You can message it to us on LinkedIn, on our Facebook page, on Twitter, on Instagram, and on YouTube, all of it under various versions of Liberal Arts MBA. So hit us up there. We are going to be bringing you a new season shortly, which will get back to, the heart and soul of where we started, which is interviewing folks like you to talk about your college to career to leadership journey. If you would like to be interviewed, if you have a story you want to tell, hit us up. If you hit us up last season and we didn't get to you, hit us up again because a lot of time has passed. We still want to talk to you. And then if you did not go to college, I also want to invite those voices into the conversation to help us better understand what the career to leadership journey looks like in that space. And we're excited to just be picking up the conversation with y'all again. So we're developing season 2 now. Message us as soon as you see this with your feedback, with your thoughts, and also if you want to be part of the next series.
Yeah.
Jacob, anything to add?
You hit everything. Onward and upward, everybody.
Onward and upward with the arts.
Yeah. Fuck the prison system.
Amen.
But also, especially here in Texas where we are, there are a lot of great programs to help the incarcerated. Particularly, there's a great book program that can be supported in a lot of ways. Texas Book Prisoner Program, I believe the project is what it's called. You can donate books, you can donate time, you can donate money. There's a lot of ways to actually help that organization. So just that popped in my head. It's a way to throw some information in there to fight back as much as we can. All right.
Y'all, been a pleasure. Cool. Thanks for coming to episode 1 of Opinions on Opinions, and we will see you next time.
Peace.
Peace.